The morning of December 30, 2023, found King Charles III in his private study at Clarence House, surrounded by documents that most people would never imagine existed. Spread across his mahogany desk were handwritten notes from his mother's personal files, detailed schedules that had been followed by British monarchs for over 3 centuries, and a peculiar collection of items that would seem ordinary to anyone unfamiliar with their deeper significance. Charles picked up a small silver bell, its surface worn smooth by generations of royal hands. This wasn't just any bell, it was the same one that had summoned his great-great-great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, to begin her New Year preparations in 1837. The bell's gentle chime had marked the beginning of royal New Year customs for nearly 200 years, and Charles could feel the weight of history in its familiar sound. The king's private secretary, a distinguished man named Sir Clive Alderton, entered the study carrying a thick folder marked with the royal seal. Inside were the detailed instructions for the upcoming New Year ceremonies, documents that had been carefully preserved and updated by each generation of royal staff. These weren't the public ceremonies that newspapers would cover, these were the private rituals that formed the true foundation of how the British monarchy approached each new year. "Your Majesty," Sir Clive began, his voice carrying the respectful formality that marked all interactions within the royal household, "the preparations for the New Year observances are proceeding according to tradition. The staff at Balmoral have confirmed that the Highland ceremony elements are ready, and Windsor has prepared the midnight chamber exactly as specified in the Queen Mother's notes." Charles nodded, his fingers tracing the edges of his mother's handwriting on a document dated just months before her passing. Queen Elizabeth II had spent her final New Year documenting every detail of the customs she had followed for 70 years, ensuring that her son would have complete guidance for carrying forward these essential traditions. Her notes revealed something that the public had never known: the royal New Year customs weren't just about celebration, but about setting the spiritual and practical foundation for the monarch's duties in the year ahead. The foundation of these customs stretched back to King Alfred the Great, who had established the principle that a monarch's first actions in each new year would determine the character of their reign for the following 12 months. Over the centuries, this belief had evolved into an intricate system of rituals that combined ancient Saxon traditions, medieval Christian practices, and carefully developed royal protocols that addressed the unique challenges of modern monarchy. Charles opened his mother's journal to a page marked with a small ribbon. Her elegant handwriting described the 3 pillars of royal New Year observance: the private meditation that connected the monarch to their sacred duties, the symbolic actions that represented their commitment to their people, and the practical ceremonies that set the tone for the year's governance. Each pillar required specific preparation, and Charles had spent weeks ensuring that every detail would be properly observed. The first pillar, the private meditation, required the monarch to spend the final hour before midnight in complete solitude, reviewing the lessons of the past year and setting their intentions for the year ahead. This wasn't simply personal reflection, it was considered a sacred duty that connected the monarch to the divine authority that legitimized their rule. Queen Elizabeth had written extensive notes about this practice, describing how she had used these quiet moments to process the greatest challenges of her reign and find the wisdom needed to guide the nation through difficult times. The second pillar involved a series of symbolic actions that demonstrated the monarch's commitment to their people. These included the lighting of a special candle that would burn throughout New Year's Day, the signing of a personal covenant that renewed the monarch's vows of service, and the blessing of water that would be used in royal ceremonies throughout the coming year. Each action carried deep meaning that connected the monarch to centuries of royal tradition while acknowledging their responsibilities in the modern world. The third pillar encompassed the practical ceremonies that established the operational tone for the royal household's work in the new year. This included private meetings with key advisors to discuss the year's priorities, the review of charitable commitments and public duties, and the careful planning of how the monarchy would support the government's work while maintaining its essential political neutrality. As Charles studied these documents, he reflected on how different his approach to the new year had become since ascending to the throne. During his decades as Prince of Wales, he had participated in many of these customs as an observer, learning their significance while his mother carried the full weight of their responsibility. Now, as king, he understood that these weren't merely traditions to be preserved, they were living practices that shaped his ability to serve effectively as monarch. The transformation from heir to sovereign had brought Charles a profound appreciation for why these customs had survived for so many centuries. They weren't arbitrary traditions maintained for their historical interest, they were practical tools that helped each monarch navigate the unique challenges of their role. The private meditation provided essential clarity and spiritual grounding, the symbolic actions reinforced the monarch's connection to their sacred duties, and the practical ceremonies ensured that the royal household would operate effectively in service of the nation. Charles closed his mother's journal and walked to the window overlooking the garden at Clarence House. The winter afternoon was drawing to a close, and he could see his staff moving purposefully through their own preparations for the coming celebrations. These dedicated individuals would ensure that every public aspect of the royal New Year would proceed flawlessly, but the private customs that truly mattered would rest entirely on Charles's shoulders. The king returned to his desk and began his own preparations for the evening ahead. He carefully reviewed each element of the customs he would observe, ensuring that he understood not just what he needed to do, but why each action mattered. This wasn't merely about following tradition, it was about taking responsibility for the spiritual and practical leadership that the monarchy provided to the British people and the Commonwealth nations. As evening approached, Charles felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and responsibility that had marked every significant moment of his long journey to the throne. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight's observance of these ancient customs would provide the foundation he needed to meet them with wisdom, dedication, and the strength that came from knowing he was part of something much larger than himself. The evening of December 31, 2023, began for King Charles III much earlier than it did for most of his subjects. While the nation prepared for parties and celebrations, the king was beginning a day-long process of preparation that would culminate in the private New Year customs that had guided British monarchs for centuries. At precisely 6 a.m., Charles was awakened not by an alarm clock or a servant, but by the same silver bell that had marked royal New Year preparations since Queen Victoria's time. This wasn't mere theatrical tradition, the early rising was essential to the spiritual preparation that the customs required. The monarch needed time to clear their mind of worldly concerns and focus entirely on the sacred responsibilities that the new year would bring. Charles began his morning with a practice that his mother had taught him decades earlier, a careful reading of the New Year entries from the journals of previous monarchs. These weren't public documents, but private reflections that revealed how each king and queen had approached the challenge of leadership during their own time. Queen Elizabeth II had maintained this tradition throughout her 70-year reign, finding wisdom and guidance in the words of her predecessors. The journal entries revealed fascinating insights into how different monarchs had used the New Year customs to navigate the challenges of their times. King George VI, Charles's grandfather, had written extensively about how the customs had helped him find the courage to lead the nation through World War II. Queen Victoria had described how the traditions had guided her through the grief of losing Prince Albert and helped her recommit to her duties after years of seclusion. Most meaningful to Charles were his mother's own entries, which chronicled her evolution from a young woman thrust unexpectedly into sovereignty to the experienced monarch who had become a symbol of stability for the modern world. Her early entries revealed the uncertainty and fear she had felt as a 25-year-old queen facing the enormous responsibilities of the crown. Her later writings showed how the annual renewal of these customs had become a source of strength and clarity that sustained her through decades of change and challenge. One entry from 1992, the year Elizabeth had famously described as her annus horribilis, particularly struck Charles. His mother had written about how the New Year customs had helped her find perspective after a year marked by family scandals, public criticism, and the devastating fire at Windsor Castle. The private meditation had reminded her that the monarchy's purpose extended far beyond the temporary troubles that dominated newspaper headlines. The symbolic actions had reconnected her to the deeper meaning of her role, and the practical ceremonies had helped her refocus on the essential work of serving the British people. Reading these intimate reflections helped Charles understand why his mother had been so insistent that he learn every detail of the New Year customs, even though she had expected to reign for many more years. Elizabeth had recognized that these traditions weren't just personal practices, they were essential tools for royal leadership that became more important, not less, as the challenges of monarchy grew more complex in the modern world. After completing his reading, Charles moved to the next phase of his preparation, the careful review of the symbolic items that would be used in the evening's ceremonies. Each object had been selected by previous monarchs to represent different aspects of royal duty, and understanding their significance was crucial to performing the customs with the proper intention and reverence. The crown jewels included several pieces that were used exclusively for New Year ceremonies, including a simple gold ring that had been worn by every British monarch since King George III. The ring wasn't valuable for its material worth, the gold was soft and the design was plain, but for its symbolic meaning. Each monarch wore the ring during their New Year meditation, connecting them directly to the continuous chain of royal service that stretched back through generations. There was also a small crystal bowl that had been crafted specifically for the water blessing ceremony. The bowl itself was unremarkable, but the water it would contain came from 7 sacred springs across the British Isles, each representing a different aspect of the monarch's connection to the land and people they served. The mixing of these waters symbolized the unity of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth, while the blessing transformed ordinary water into a substance that would be used throughout the year in royal ceremonies. Perhaps most important was a leather-bound book that contained the text of the personal covenant that each monarch signed during their New Year observance. The covenant wasn't a legal document, it was a private commitment that renewed the monarch's dedication to their sacred duties. The words had been refined over centuries to capture the essential elements of royal service: the commitment to put the welfare of the people above personal interest, the promise to preserve and protect the institutions of democratic government, and the pledge to maintain the moral and spiritual leadership that the monarchy provided to the nation. Charles spent considerable time reviewing the covenant text, understanding that the words he would speak and sign in just a few hours would shape his approach to kingship throughout the coming year. This wasn't mere ceremony, it was a solemn commitment that would guide his decisions on everything from state visits to charitable patronages to the delicate balance between supporting elected government and maintaining royal independence. The afternoon was dedicated to practical preparations that would ensure the evening ceremonies could proceed without interruption. Charles met privately with his most senior advisors to review the year ahead, discussing the major challenges and opportunities that would define his second year as monarch. These conversations weren't about policy, the king was careful to maintain the political neutrality that was essential to constitutional monarchy, but about how the royal household could best support the nation's work while fulfilling its own unique responsibilities. Sir Clive Alderton presented a detailed schedule of the year's major events, from state visits to Commonwealth meetings to the numerous charitable events that formed such an important part of modern royal work. Each commitment had been carefully considered not just for its immediate importance, but for how it would contribute to the monarchy's broader mission of service and leadership. The Queen Consort, Camilla, joined these discussions, bringing her own perspective on how the royal household could most effectively support the causes and organizations that mattered most to the British people. Her experience and insight had become invaluable to Charles, particularly in helping him navigate the complex balance between honoring tradition and adapting to changing social needs. As evening approached, Charles began the final phase of his preparation, the physical and spiritual transition from the ordinary concerns of daily life to the sacred space of New Year observance. He changed into clothing that had been specially prepared for the ceremonies, including a simple white shirt that symbolized purity of intention and a dark jacket that represented the weight of responsibility he carried. The king's final preparation was perhaps the most personal, a quiet prayer in the private chapel at Windsor Castle, where he had come to observe the most important elements of the New Year customs. This wasn't a formal religious service, but a private moment of connection with the divine authority that legitimized his role as monarch. Charles had always taken the spiritual aspects of kingship seriously, understanding that his authority ultimately derived not from political power or popular approval, but from a sacred trust that connected him to something greater than himself. As the last hours of 2023 ticked away, Charles felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and solemnity that marked the approach of these ancient customs. The weight of tradition wasn't a burden to be endured, but a source of strength that connected him to centuries of royal service. Tonight's observance would renew and strengthen that connection, providing the foundation he needed to serve effectively as king throughout the year ahead. At 11 p.m. on December 31, 2023, King Charles III excused himself from the New Year's Eve gathering at Windsor Castle and made his way to a chamber that few people had ever seen. The Queen's private meditation room, as it had been known during his mother's reign, was a small, simply furnished space that had been specifically designed for the most sacred elements of royal New Year observance. The room itself reflected the solemn purpose it served. Unlike the ornate staterooms that visitors associated with Windsor Castle, this chamber was furnished with deliberate simplicity. A single chair faced east toward Jerusalem, following a tradition established by medieval monarchs who had wanted their New Year meditation to connect them with the Holy Land. A small table held the symbolic items that would be used in the ceremony, and the walls were lined with portraits of previous monarchs, their painted eyes seeming to watch over the sacred space. Charles had spent considerable time in this room during his mother's reign, learning the customs that would one day become his responsibility. But, entering the chamber as king, knowing that the full weight of the ceremony now rested on his shoulders, filled him with a profound sense of both honor and responsibility that was unlike anything he had experienced as Prince of Wales. The king began by lighting the New Year candle, a thick white taper that had been made specifically for this ceremony using wax from beehives maintained on the royal estates. The candle would burn continuously throughout New Year's Day, symbolizing the eternal nature of the monarch's commitment to their people. As Charles touched the flame to the wick, he spoke the traditional words that had been used by British monarchs for over 300 years, "As this light burns steadily through the turning of the year, so shall my service to my people remain constant and true." The lighting of the candle marked the beginning of what royal protocol called the sacred hour, the 60 minutes of private meditation that formed the spiritual heart of the New Year customs. This wasn't simply quiet reflection, but a structured practice that had been developed over centuries to help monarchs process the lessons of the past year and prepare spiritually for the challenges ahead. Charles settled into the meditation chair and opened his mother's personal New Year journal to the pages she had marked for his guidance. Queen Elizabeth II had spent decades refining her approach to this sacred hour, and her notes provided a detailed framework for the meditation that followed the pattern she had found most meaningful and effective. The first 20 minutes were dedicated to what the royal traditions called the review of service, a careful examination of the past year's major decisions and their outcomes. This wasn't self-criticism or regret, but an honest assessment of how well the monarch had fulfilled their duties and what lessons could be learned for the future. Charles reflected on the major events of his first full year as king. The coronation ceremony had been a moment of profound significance, not just for the spectacle it provided to the world, but for the private moment when the Archbishop of Canterbury had placed the crown on his head and he had felt the full weight of royal responsibility settle on his shoulders. The months that followed had brought both triumphs and challenges, from successful state visits that had strengthened Britain's international relationships to difficult moments when the monarchy's role in modern society had been questioned by critics. The meditation helped Charles see these events not as isolated incidents, but as part of the continuing story of constitutional monarchy adapting to serve the needs of a changing world. His mother's notes reminded him that every monarch faced similar challenges in their own time, and that the key to effective royal leadership was learning from both successes and setbacks while maintaining unwavering commitment to the essential principles of service. The second 20 minutes focused on the Covenant of Tomorrow, a forward-looking meditation that helped the monarch identify the major priorities and challenges of the coming year. This wasn't strategic planning in a business sense, but a spiritual practice that sought divine guidance for the decisions that would shape the monarchy's work in the months ahead. Charles considered the major events already scheduled for 2024, from Commonwealth meetings that would require delicate diplomatic leadership to domestic ceremonies that would celebrate important milestones in British life. Each commitment represented an opportunity to demonstrate the monarchy's continuing relevance and value to the nation, but also carried the risk of missteps that could damage the institution's reputation and effectiveness. The meditation helped Charles understand that his role as king wasn't primarily about making policy decisions or managing political relationships, but about providing the moral and spiritual leadership that connected the British people to their deepest values and aspirations. The monarchy's power lay not in what it could command, but in what it could inspire, the example it set for public service, the stability it provided during times of change, and the sense of continuity it offered to link past, present, and future. The final 20 minutes of the sacred hour were devoted to the prayer of dedication, a personal renewal of the monarch's commitment to their sacred duties. This was the most intimate part of the New Year customs, when the king or queen spoke directly to God about their hopes, fears, and determination to serve faithfully in the year ahead. Charles's prayer drew on the words and phrases that had been used by his predecessors, but also reflected his own particular concerns and commitments as a 21st century monarch. He prayed for wisdom to navigate the complex challenges of modern kingship, strength to fulfill his duties despite advancing age, and grace to serve as a worthy link in the chain of royal service that stretched back through centuries of British history. The prayer also included specific petitions for the people and nations he served. Charles prayed for the welfare of his subjects throughout the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth, for the success of democratic government in all its forms, and for peace and prosperity throughout the world. These weren't vague generalities, but heartfelt requests that reflected the king's deep understanding of his role as a servant leader whose primary responsibility was the welfare of others. As the sacred hour drew to a close, Charles felt the profound sense of renewal and clarity that his mother had described in her journal entries. The meditation hadn't resolved all of the challenges he would face in the coming year, but it had provided the spiritual foundation he needed to approach them with confidence and wisdom. The king rose from the meditation chair and moved to the small table where the covenant document waited for his signature. The text had been prepared by royal scribes using traditional methods, hand-lettered on parchment using ink made from historical formulas. The words themselves were both ancient and timeless, expressing commitments that were as relevant to modern monarchy as they had been to medieval kingship. Charles read the covenant text carefully, understanding that his signature would make these words a sacred promise that would guide his actions throughout the year. I, Charles, by the grace of God King of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and of his other realms and territories, do solemnly renew my covenant of service to God and to my people. I pledge to rule with justice and mercy, to protect the innocent and defend the realm, to support lawful government and preserve the rights and liberties of all my subjects. The signing ceremony was witnessed only by the portraits of previous monarchs that lined the chamber walls, but Charles felt their presence as a reminder of the countless kings and queens who had made similar commitments in their own time. His signature linked him to that unbroken chain of royal service, while also acknowledging his particular responsibility to carry the monarchy forward into an uncertain but hopeful future. As midnight approached, Charles completed the final element of the sacred hour by blessing the water that would be used in royal ceremonies throughout 2024. The simple crystal bowl contained water from 7 sacred springs, each representing a different aspect of the monarch's connection to the British Isles. As Charles spoke the traditional blessing, he felt the weight of centuries of royal tradition while also recognizing the living, breathing nature of customs that continue to provide meaning and purpose in the modern world. The clock struck midnight as Charles completed the water blessing, marking not just the beginning of 2024, but the successful completion of New Year customs that had renewed his spiritual connection to the crown and prepared him for another year of dedicated service as king. Part 4, The People's King. The morning of January 1, 2024, found King Charles III beginning the new year with customs that connected him directly to the people he served. While most of his subjects were sleeping off the previous night's celebrations, the king was participating in traditions that demonstrated the monarchy's commitment to being accessible and relevant to ordinary British lives. At dawn, Charles made his way to the Long Walk at Windsor Castle for a practice that Queen Elizabeth II had established early in her reign, a solitary New Year's morning walk that allowed the monarch to reflect on their connection to the land and people of Britain. This wasn't a public event or photo opportunity, but a private moment of communion with the natural world that had sustained British civilization for thousands of years. The king walked slowly along the ancient path, observing the winter landscape and thinking about the millions of his subjects who were beginning their own New Year's Day traditions throughout the United Kingdom and Commonwealth. Some would be attending church services, others would be enjoying family gatherings, and many would be making personal resolutions for the year ahead. Charles understood that his own New Year observances were part of this broader tapestry of renewal and hope that marked the turning of the calendar. The dawn walk concluded at a small memorial garden that honored the service members who had died defending the realm. Charles spent several minutes in silent prayer at the memorial, acknowledging the sacrifice that made his own peaceful reign possible. This wasn't merely ceremonial respect, but a personal recognition that constitutional monarchy depended on the willing service of countless individuals who put the nation's welfare above their own interests. Returning to the castle, Charles began the second phase of his New Year's Day observance, the reading of letters from ordinary citizens who had written to share their hopes, concerns, and suggestions for the year ahead. These weren't the formal communications that reached the king through official channels, but personal messages that revealed the real thoughts and feelings of the people he served. The royal household received thousands of letters each year, and the king's private secretary had selected a representative sample that reflected the diversity of British society. There were letters from schoolchildren describing their dreams for the future, from elderly citizens sharing their memories and wisdom, from families struggling with economic hardship, and from community leaders working to solve local problems. Charles read each letter carefully, understanding that these personal communications provided insights into British life that no official briefing could match. The letters revealed both the challenges his subjects faced and the remarkable resilience and creativity they showed in addressing them. Many writers expressed gratitude for the stability and continuity that the monarchy provided, but others offered thoughtful criticism or suggestions for how royal leadership could better serve the nation's needs. One letter that particularly moved Charles came from a young mother in Manchester who described how the royal family's commitment to charitable work had inspired her to start a community garden that provided fresh food for families in need. Her project had grown from a small plot behind her flat to a network of gardens throughout her neighborhood, demonstrating the ripple effect that royal example could have on ordinary lives. Another meaningful communication came from a veteran who had served in Afghanistan and was now working to help other former service members adjust to civilian life. He wrote about how the king's military service and ongoing support for veterans' causes had provided hope and encouragement during his own difficult transition. His letter reminded Charles that the monarchy's value lay not just in ceremonial functions, but in the real impact it could have on individual lives. The letter reading concluded with messages from Commonwealth nations, where citizens expressed their continued appreciation for the monarchy's role in maintaining connections between diverse peoples and cultures. These letters revealed how the royal family served as a living symbol of shared values and common purpose that transcended national boundaries and ethnic differences. After completing the letter reading, Charles moved to the third major element of his New Year's Day observance, private meetings with representatives of the charitable organizations that formed such an important part of his royal work. These weren't formal audiences, but working sessions where the king could learn directly about the challenges facing British society and how royal patronage could most effectively support efforts to address them. The first meeting was with leaders from organizations focused on environmental conservation, a cause that had been central to Charles's work for decades. The representatives shared updates on climate change initiatives, wildlife preservation projects, and sustainable development programs that were making real differences in communities throughout the United Kingdom. They also discussed how royal support could help expand successful programs and overcome obstacles that limited their effectiveness. Charles's environmental work had sometimes been controversial during his years as Prince of Wales, with critics arguing that he had overstepped appropriate boundaries for a future monarch. But his New Year's Day meetings confirmed that his long advocacy for environmental protection had helped establish the monarchy as a respected voice for sustainability and conservation. The organizations he supported weren't asking for political advocacy, but for the kind of moral leadership and public attention that royal patronage uniquely provided. The second meeting focused on youth development programs that helped young people develop skills, confidence, and opportunities for success. The king learned about innovative programs that combined traditional education with practical training, community service projects that engaged teenagers in solving local problems, and mentorship initiatives that connected young people with successful adults who could guide their development. These programs revealed the monarchy's potential to serve as a bridge between different generations of British society. Young people who might otherwise view the royal family as an irrelevant relic of the past were finding meaningful connections through shared work on projects they cared about. The king's genuine interest in their ideas and concerns helped demonstrate that the monarchy remained relevant to contemporary life. The final meeting of the day addressed issues of social inclusion and community cohesion, areas where the monarchy's unifying role could have particular value. Representatives from organizations working with immigrant communities, religious minorities, and economically disadvantaged populations shared their insights about how royal leadership could help build stronger, more inclusive British society. These conversations revealed both the opportunities and challenges facing modern monarchy. The royal family's traditional role as a symbol of British identity could either help unite diverse populations around shared values or risk alienating people who didn't see themselves reflected in traditional royal imagery. The key was ensuring that royal leadership truly served all British people, regardless of their background or circumstances. Charles concluded his New Year's Day observances with a practice that had become personally meaningful to him: a private review of his mother's example and guidance. Queen Elizabeth II had spent 70 years learning how to balance the competing demands of modern monarchy, and her wisdom continued to guide her son's approach to royal leadership. The late Queen's journal entries revealed how she had used New Year's Day reflections to assess her own performance and identify areas for improvement. She had been remarkably honest about her mistakes and limitations, while also recognizing the positive impact that dedicated royal service could have on individual lives and British society as a whole. One of Elizabeth's most insightful observations was that the monarchy's greatest strength lay not in its power or prestige, but in its commitment to consistent, selfless service over time. Individual royal actions might have limited immediate impact, but the cumulative effect of decades of dedicated work could genuinely help build a better society. As Charles concluded his New Year's Day observances, he felt a renewed sense of purpose and determination. The customs he had followed weren't merely historical traditions, but living practices that connected him to the people he served and the values that made constitutional monarchy relevant to contemporary life. The year ahead would bring new challenges and opportunities, but his New Year observances had provided the foundation he needed to meet them with wisdom, humility, and unwavering commitment to service. 3 months into 2024, King Charles III could already see how his New Year observances had shaped his approach to the challenges and opportunities of his second year as monarch. The customs that had seemed like historical traditions were proving to be practical tools for effective royal leadership in the 21st century. The Sacred Hour meditation had provided Charles with a framework for decision-making that proved invaluable when facing difficult choices about royal priorities and commitments. When controversial issues arose that tested the monarchy's political neutrality, the king found himself drawing on the clarity and wisdom he had gained during his New Year reflection. The principles he had renewed during that midnight ceremony, service to others, protection of democratic institutions, and moral leadership by example, served as reliable guides when navigating complex situations. One significant test came when political tensions arose over Britain's relationship with European Union institutions. Some politicians and commentators tried to draw the king into the debate, seeking royal endorsement for their positions on post-Brexit policies. Charles's New Year commitment to political neutrality helped him find ways to support British interests without taking partisan positions, demonstrating how traditional royal principles could address contemporary challenges. The king's approach was to focus on areas where royal leadership could genuinely help, supporting cultural and educational exchanges that strengthened relationships between British and European institutions, promoting charitable collaborations that addressed shared challenges, and maintaining personal relationships with European leaders that facilitated diplomatic cooperation. This strategy honored the monarchy's constitutional role while providing real value to the nation's international relationships. The water blessing ceremony had created opportunities for meaningful connections with religious and community leaders throughout the Commonwealth. The blessed water was used in several significant ceremonies during the early months of 2024, including the dedication of a new interfaith community center in Birmingham and the blessing of a memorial garden honoring Commonwealth service members who had died in recent conflicts. These events demonstrated how ancient royal customs could address contemporary needs for healing, unity, and hope. The symbolic power of royal participation wasn't diminished by modern skepticism. If anything, it became more precious because it was rarer and more deliberately chosen. People who attended these ceremonies often commented on how the combination of traditional ritual and genuine royal engagement created moments of significance that transcended ordinary political or social divisions. The letter-reading tradition had evolved into an ongoing practice that kept Charles connected to the real concerns and aspirations of his subjects. The royal household established a more systematic approach to collecting and analyzing correspondence from ordinary citizens, creating a valuable source of insight into public opinion and social trends that complemented official polling and media analysis. The letters revealed that British people appreciated royal leadership that was both traditional and responsive to contemporary needs. Writers expressed particular gratitude for the monarchy's commitment to charitable work, environmental protection, and support for community organizations that made real differences in local communities. They also offered thoughtful suggestions for how royal leadership could address emerging challenges like social media's impact on young people, the needs of an aging population, and the integration of immigrant communities. Charles began using insights from this correspondence to shape his public speeches and charitable priorities. When he spoke about the importance of community resilience, his words carried extra authenticity because they reflected real stories from citizens who had shared their experiences with him. When he visited organizations working on social problems, his questions and comments demonstrated genuine understanding of the challenges they faced. The charitable meetings that had begun on New Year's Day developed into a more structured approach to royal patronage that maximized the impact of limited royal time and attention. Instead of simply lending his name to worthy causes, Charles began working more strategically to identify organizations and projects that could benefit most from royal support and that aligned with the monarchy's broader mission of service. This approach proved particularly effective in environmental conservation, where the king's decades of advocacy had established the monarchy as a credible voice for sustainability. Royal patronage helped expand successful conservation programs, attract additional funding and support, and connect local environmental projects with national and international resources. The youth development programs that Charles had learned about during his New Year meetings became a particular focus of his work in 2024. The king recognized that the monarchy's long-term relevance depended on its ability to engage meaningfully with younger generations who might not share their parents' or grandparents' automatic respect for traditional institutions. Rather than trying to appear artificially youthful or trendy, Charles approached young people with genuine interest in their ideas and concerns. He visited innovative schools and training programs, met with young entrepreneurs and activists, and listened carefully to their critiques and suggestions for how British society could better serve their needs and aspirations. These interactions often surprised both the king and the young people involved, creating mutual respect based on shared commitment to making positive differences in the world. The Commonwealth dimension of Charles's New Year observances had particular significance as 2024 brought new challenges to the relationships between Britain and former colonies that had chosen to remain connected through the Commonwealth Association. Some nations were reconsidering their ties to the British monarchy, while others were strengthening their engagement with Commonwealth institutions and values. Charles's approach was to focus on the practical benefits that Commonwealth membership could provide: trade relationships, educational exchanges, cultural collaborations, and shared responses to global challenges like climate change and public health threats. Rather than defending the monarchy's historical role, he worked to demonstrate its continuing relevance as a force for cooperation and mutual support among diverse nations. This strategy proved successful in several cases where Commonwealth relationships had been strained by historical grievances or contemporary political pressures. By acknowledging past wrongs while focusing on future opportunities, Charles helped maintain valuable connections that served the interests of all Commonwealth members. As Charles reflected on the first months of 2024, he realized that his New Year customs had provided more than spiritual renewal, they had equipped him with practical tools for effective monarchy that honored tradition while addressing contemporary needs. The meditation practice had strengthened his judgment and decision-making abilities. The symbolic ceremonies had created opportunities for meaningful public engagement. The letter reading had kept him connected to his subjects' real concerns. The charitable meetings had focused his efforts on areas where royal leadership could make genuine differences. Perhaps most importantly, the New Year observances had reminded Charles that constitutional monarchy's value lay not in its power or prestige, but in its capacity for consistent, selfless service over time. Individual royal actions might seem small compared to the great political and social forces shaping the modern world, but their cumulative effect could genuinely help build a more just, compassionate, and unified society. The customs that King Charles III had inherited from centuries of royal tradition weren't merely historical artifacts to be preserved for their own sake. They were living practices that connected contemporary monarchy to timeless principles of service, duty, and moral leadership that remained as relevant in the 21st century as they had been in previous ages. As Charles looked ahead to the remaining months of 2024 and the New Year observances that would mark the beginning of 2025, he felt confident that the ancient wisdom embedded in royal tradition would continue to provide guidance for meeting new challenges with courage, wisdom, and unwavering commitment to the welfare of the people he served. The royal New Year customs had proven their worth once again, shaping not just a monarch's personal spiritual life, but his ability to provide the kind of leadership that constitutional monarchy could uniquely offer to a complex and changing world.